Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to get spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. Now, if you are hearing this right now, then you are not currently a Journal Feed subscriber, and so will not be receiving the full Journal Feed podcast, only getting a portion of the past week's articles. If you would like to get full access to both the podcast and the blog, then you'll have to become a member. All the details for that are at journalfeed.org. And remember, we never want money to be a barrier to better patient care. So if you're having any trouble affording a subscription, just get in touch. We'll help you out. Now, this is the audio version of the past week's summaries, which were brought to you by our authors, Chris Thome, Joshua Belford, Jonathan Brewer, Megan Hilbert, and of course, Clay Smith. Okay, let's get straight into the first article, which was titled Risk of Internal Carotid Injury During Peritonsillar Abscess Drainage in the Emergency Department, out of the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. Peritonsillar abscesses, PTAs, they're a pretty common complaint for the emergency department. And of course, this is kind of one of our bread and butter things to drain PTAs. It's not that hard to do. I mean, it's pretty obvious what needs to be drained when you see most cases of this. However, there are fears for this because in that general area near there is the carotid artery. And if you were to try to drain a carotid artery, of course, this would be a disaster. And so it is always instilled in every emergency medicine graduate and trainee that you need to be worried about this. However, these authors tried to look into the evidence, and they say that they found no instances of reported carotid artery punctures or injuries as related to draining a PTA. Now, they didn't actually get into how they did their literature searches for this. They just said they weren't aware of anything. I would have liked to see them be a little bit more formal and really trying to find it. When I look around a little bit briefly, I definitely see some instances of like pseudoaneurysms and stuff like that. So there definitely is some evidence that shows some kinds of injuries as a result of PTA drainages, but not necessarily a full exsanguination. However, people are not very eager to publish when they do something that could potentially kill someone for a relatively benign diagnosis. So if it is happening, I wouldn't blame anyone for not writing a case report on it. All the same, these authors wanted to look back at their own center and see what the risks and anatomy generally was of the PTAs that had gone through their place. So this was a single center retrospective study of 74 PTA patients who were aged 18 and older. So we're not talking about pediatrics. They came from the right side, the left side, or some patients had both sides. Some were drained by emergency physicians and some drained by ENT. In the cases where they had a CT scan to diagnose this, they were able to look at the distances which would be relevant that you might want to keep in mind if you were to avoid the carotid artery. And they report that the median distance from the back of the abscess to the carotid artery was 1.55 centimeters. What a dumb number for you to tell me. I'm sorry to say it that way, but really, I don't want to know what the middle number is, the median. That's kind of a ridiculous number for you to report. I want to know the range, probably. What is safe? What is a safe distance in 95% of the instances? Not just the middle number. You need to give me more statistics than that. Even the mean, I think, would be more realistic and more useful in this circumstance, because if it's being dragged down by a lot of very small, short distances, then I need to know that. The median is useless. Again, the median abscess cavity size was 2 centimeters in depth. And so, again, we're working on medians here for some reason. This would mean that you've got about 2.5 centimeters of wiggle room if you do the typical advice of only inserting your needle 1 to 1.5 centimeters total into the abscess itself. The going advice that I tend to see from everybody is take the cap that usually goes on your 18 or 19 gauge needle and just cut off a centimeter and a half off the tip. And then this way you can't insert that needle farther than that, and thus making this a really quite safe procedure, which apparently it is already, either because people are very, they've had it really ingrained into them that there's a carotid artery there, and so they're very careful, and so we don't have a lot of complications from this, or people just aren't publishing when the bad things happen. But either way, it seems to be a relatively safe procedure. In a spoonful, this study showed that from a single center sample, there were no carotid artery punctures from PTA drainages out of 74 cases that they could find. And apparently none in the literature either. So keep up your normal practices. Apparently they're probably quite safe. And then we have the second article titled The Effects of Liquid Bleach Ingestion on Children's Esophageal and Gastric Mucosa, out of the journal Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition. Now, of course, while adults drink things, pediatric patients can also drink things, and sometimes these things that people drink are caustic. One of the most common caustics to have around the house is, of course, bleach. Now, the usual teaching is that basic solutions are worse because you get that kind of saponification, and then it can really just get much deeper ulcers as a result. Whereas with acids, although they might absorb into your body and then you get other side effects from it, they are typically going to cause more of a coagulopathic necrosis and thus kind of form their own barrier from getting a deeper penetration. All that said, we know very little about people drinking acids because people don't have access to strong caustic acid solutions in the home. But we do know a lot more about bleach and basic solutions. So, typically, the teaching is that bleach, well, sounds dangerous, and some people have recommended you drink it for COVID. I wouldn't do that. It's not actually that bad in most circumstances. However, that's mostly adult literature. This study wanted to look at instances of bleach ingestion in a pediatric center. So this was a large prospective Italian study which analyzed 100 children, mean age of almost 6 years old, who had ingested commercially available household bleach, be it the chloride-based solutions or the peroxidase-based solutions. And they also included some patients who had ingested industrial bleaches or artisanal bleaches that people make at home. You might remember that when you do an endoscopy and you look at the damage to the esophagus, these fall into the Zargar grading score, where 0 being normal and 3 being really bad. Of the 100 children in their analysis, 71 of these children underwent endoscopy. 86% of them had absolutely normal findings. 11% had mild erythema, and just 3% had superficial ulcers. Both of those superficial ulcer cases, Zargar 2A, involved homemade bleach, which is probably going to be more concentrated than the typical stuff you'd buy off the shelf. And thus none of the children who drank the typical commercially available bleach had significant mucosal injuries, compared to 36% of the children who had the homemade or industrial bleach solution, which were not as well off. However, all children were asymptomatic at the 1, 3, and 6 month follow-up visits, and there was no instances of esophageal strictures reported. Now, of course, there are limitations for studies like this. These are young children doing this drinking. A lot of it is exploratory. Some of it was for self-harm purposes, and in almost no cases did they have any real idea of how much volume was actually ingested. So it's interesting and kind of expected. We see minimal damage in adults, and adults tend to drink a lot more caustics than children do. So if the child came in and the report is that they drank some bleach, you can be mostly quite reassured. But still look for severe warning signs such as burns in the mouth, work of breathing, or drooling. In a spoonful, bleach, unless industrial or homemade, tends to be relatively harmless when ingested by children. Okay, that's the 5 articles from this week. Let's do a quick review of everything we talked about. From the first article, no one has ever punctured the carotid while doing a PTA drainage. These authors had none at their center and didn't find any in the literature, although I'm not sure that they looked that hard. And I can pretty quickly find some instances of some kinds of complications if you just kind of Google it and find articles that way. Alas, it still seems to be a pretty safe procedure, even if this article just reported median values, which I don't like. And then from the second article, most people, even children, don't need routine gastroscopy for bleach ingestions. Again, if you are hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. What were those articles that you missed? Well, what's the word on POCUS for skin and soft tissue infections? After that, how do you incorporate POCUS for ruling out DVTs? And then finally, does ketorolac really work in pediatrics for pain control? Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org, or just follow the links in the show notes. Our goal here is for you to read less, learn more, and save lives, one spoonful at a time. Thank you.